Ty Seidule, author of Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause. He's a vice chair of the Naming Commission out to rename many of the Army posts that honor Confederate officers. He's a professor at Hamilton College and most recently, before that, the former head of the Department of History at West Point, our nation's military academy. Look, this is one of the books that I wish everyone in the United States could read. I, like the author, grew up in a part of the country that embraced this revisionist historical perspective on the Civil War. And my community idolized General Robert E. Lee. And I didn't understand why. And reading this book was nothing short of cathartic for me. I felt it's so important that I am using every opportunity and platform I have to make sure that Ty gets his message spread as far and wide as possible. So first, would love to introduce you to Mr. Ty Seidule. Ty, thank you so much for joining us on 99 Pages.
Rajiv, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to join you.
Right on. So first off, I'd love you. I think it's critical for you to introduce yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about where you grew up, where you're from, and how you arrived at this thesis?
Yeah, well, I'm a son of the South. I was raised in. My dad's from Mississippi. I was raised in Alexandria, Virginia, on this myth of the lost cause, which the idea that part of it was that Lee was the greatest gentleman, the greatest man that ever lived, and I'm raised Episcopalian, and on a scale of 10, I would have said that Lee was an 11. And even though good Episcopalian went to church every Sunday, I would have said Jesus was about 5. So it was, honest to goodness, it was reverential. It wasn't as though we liked him. It was that it was a reverential, because I wanted to be an educated Christian gentleman. That was the highest status where I grew up. And status was a blue blazer and a rep tie and a blue blazer and khakis and Ouija loafers. It was a sign of status. And I wanted status. So I grew up there. I later went to, my dad took another job. I was raised at a boarding school, a private, really prestigious boarding school, Virginia. Then he went and took a job in rural Georgia. And then Georgia, he went to a SEG Academy being started to make sure that white kids didn't have to go to school with black kids. And that's where I went to high school. And then college, I wanted to be that Virginia gentleman. Where to be a Virginia gentleman? Washington and Lee University. That's where Lee was college president, it's where he's buried, and where they worshiped him. And then I went in the Army. And so I had about a 36-year career in the Army, which 20 of those years were I started off in tanks and cavalry, but then eventually transitioned to be an academic. And I spent the latter half of my career at West Point, where I eventually became a professor and then professor emeritus of history. And I retired in part so that I could tell this story about Lee, about the Confederacy, about the lost cause, and try to convince other people, particularly ones that look like me, middle-aged white dudes, not necessarily bald, but certainly middle-aged white dudes, about the myth of the lost cause and about the fact that these things are created to support white supremacy and ensure white political power.
That's super interesting. And by the way, for our audience that are tuning in, if you have questions for Mr. Sedgley, go ahead and put them in the chat. We're watching it, and we'll be sure to relay them to Ty here on the broadcast. Okay, so Ty, you grow up in the South. You were steeped in this culture of the lost cause myth, and you at some point had an awakening. Something sparked in you that said this isn't quite right. Can you talk to us? Is there a moment in particular that sort of lit that spark?
I think it was, yeah. So it was three things that happened. A couple of things happened slowly and then really fast. The slow thing was I went from being a Virginia. So at Washington Lee, I ran out of money. My parents got divorced. I had no money, so I took an ROTC scholarship. And back in those days, during the Reagan era, they were giving them out like Pez. And so I took one of those, not thinking I'd ever have to go in the Army, or maybe I'd only do 4 years. I had trouble getting out. It was a problem for me to try to get out of the Army. So I took an Army scholarship. And when I was there, I raised my right hand and took the oath of office. And Rajiv, you took that same oath. Anybody that's ever served in the federal government took that oath. And that oath is to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same. Well, I took that thing surrounded by Confederate flags in Lee Chapel, but then I went into the Army. And when I went into the Army, my identity started to change. I became Army officer. I became somebody who believed in that oath more than I believed in being a Virginia gentleman. So that was the first thing that changed me. The second thing that changed me was I married a woman incapable of lying. And I grew up in a culture that was based on lies. My entire culture was based on lying. And she didn't lie. And it was like her, through her patience and love, I started to do this. And then the third thing that changed me was at West Point. So there I am, living on Lee Road by Lee Gate in Lee housing. You're shaking your head. You probably ran it. You know exactly where I'm talking
Yeah,
about. And then
absolutely.
I go by Lee Child Development Center, and then I went by our barracks. And I don't know which ones you live, but so you can just imagine this walk. I go by MacArthur Barracks, Washington, Eisenhower, and then I take a right, and it's Pershing, Grant. And I get to Lee Barracks, and I look at that, and I go, huh. I mean, I understand why things are named after Washington. I mean, these other people, and I understand why they call it Lee at Washington and Lee, but why at West Point? Why at the United States Military Academy? So I went running all over campus, all over post, and I found over a dozen things named after Lee. Like, what the hell's going on here? So then I went into the archives, and when I went into the archives, what I found shocked me. I thought that, right after the Civil War, the West Point Brotherhood would bring these people back together and it was all hunky dory, sunshine and flowers. No, in the 19th century, West Point saw the Confederates, like Lee, as traitors. And I never really thought about that term. Treason, traitors. And then I thought, well, okay, so in the 19th century, banished. So, our cemetery, no Confederates there. Battle Monument, it says War of the Rebellion, no Confederates. Cullum Hall, initially, no Confederates. Duty on Our Country is actually an anti-Confederate monument. So when did it come? And this is what turned me from a historian to an activist. I found that the monuments at West Point to Lee came in the 1930s, when our first Black cadets came back to West Point in 50 years, the 1950s, when the Army is fighting against integrating, and the early 70s, when minority admission starts. Scratch a monument at West Point, and it's a reaction to integration. And that ticked me off so much that's when I really became an activist to start trying to change these things. I just had so little success as a soldier at West Point trying to do that.
Well, it's hard to do that when you're a soldier and wearing a uniform, right? There's absolutely limits on what you can say, who you can say it to, what media events you can take. So we're so happy that as a civilian, this is your use, how you're using your time. This is incredible. So just to summarize, what you're saying in the thesis here is that these relics of Confederate lore that are particularly standing at West Point today, but probably and throughout the country, right? West Point is just a microcosm of this effect. They aren't necessarily there because at the end of the Civil War in Reconstruction, we were trying to be buddies and reunite the family. These are things that started to pop up as almost graphic objections to integration, right? As ways to kind of showcase the society's objection to Black cadets coming back to West Point or society integrating the races. And obviously, that happened much later, 100 years after the Civil War ended. So these are relatively recent resurrected statues and naming conventions. Is that basically
Yeah.
what we're saying?
Well, I think there are two periods where they come. The first period, you're exactly right. They don't come right after the Civil War, because the Civil War veterans, the United States Army. Remember, I don't call them Union soldiers. They're the United States Army, the same blue uniform that you wore, that I wore. Those are the ones. They're the United States Army soldiers, and we had an insurrectionist, rebellious force that was never recognized by anybody else, fighting them. But they came up in two periods. In the 1890 to 1920 is the first period. In fact, most of them came up then. And that's the same period when Southern states rewrote all their constitutions to exclude Black people from political process. So, they said that of course we're doing this for white supremacy. We're trying to find a legal way to ensure white political power. So that's the first thing. The second thing that occurs is lynching, white terror, to enforce racial control. The third thing that happens is Black disenfranchisement through poll taxes and literacy tests. And then Confederate monuments are the fourth thing that comes. So they're put in front of courthouses to show as a symbol of white supremacy. So what these create, these are almost the pillars with this lost cause, sort of the ideological foundation. These are the pillars of a white supremacist society, of a racial police state. And what I try to do throughout this book is to use the correct language. The South was an apartheid state and a racial police state designed to prevent Black political power, Black equality, and to create a underclass, a peonage, sort of a serfdom of Black people. And the Confederate monuments are a symbol of that. And then after World War II, then they become another form of white supremacy, but to protest against integration. So either way, they're both two sides of the same white supremacist coin.
So interesting, Ty. We have a couple questions coming in from our viewers, if you don't mind. Um,
Mhm.
can you talk us about? Jackie Newman asks, "I wonder what Union states also have Lee memorials and monuments." Can you talk about like how far north did this go? Is it exclusively in the Confederate South, south of the Mason-Dixon line, or is this also in Union
No,
states as well?
no. It's a great question. So, Jackie, great question. The issue with this is that if you think about the lost cause starting with the South, almost before the gunpowder clears, the smoke clears from the battlefield, it soon in the 20th century, if the northern states and western states sort of agree that we're going to bring America back together, reconcile. But it's white America reconciling at the expense of black people. It's like saying, "Hey, South, you're okay to do this." And then you have the Great Migration, which is black people leaving, emigrating from the South, one of the largest emigrations of people in history, in the world history, that wasn't because of a famine or war, moving to the cities of the North and the West. And by the way, had forced segregation when they got there. But you go to the Northwest, and there's Jefferson Davis Highway there. You go to Orange County, California, and there are Confederate monuments there. You can go to Martha's Vineyard. There's one there. There was one. It's been removed from the Bronx. There's still Lee and Jackson Road in Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn. So no, it's not just the southern states. They're mainly there, but it is not. And then you have the Army War College, which puts up Confederate posters. You have the Command General Staff College, where Lee is a part of their Hall of Fame. So if you go all over the place, you'll see that Lee and this lost cause ideology has infiltrated. Like I always say, if anybody's ever lived in the South before, it's like kudzu. And kudzu is this imported, you've been in the South.
Yeah.
Kudzu is this imported plant that they brought for erosion control, and its roots go down like 8 feet, and it grows 18 inches a day. And the only thing that'll stop it is cars going across there. Well, the lost cause myth is the most successful lie in disinformation campaign in American history, and it grows over everything else, and it chokes out the story. So here we are on Black History Month, and lost cause chokes out the stories that we should be doing. It doesn't allow us to have the heroes we should have. Instead we have the heroes like Robert E. Lee, who, again, to me, chose treason to preserve slavery. And so if you hear me, you'll hear me say this again and again. Remember that about Lee. He chose treason to preserve slavery. But you see this everywhere.
So let's get into some of the more interesting things that a student like me growing up in Southern Virginia heard about Robert E. Lee, and maybe I'd love to hear your pithy reaction to them to knock it down or to support it. So let's say one thing I heard was that Lee was very kind to this. He was a slave owner, but he was a very kind man to the slaves that he owned. Wasn't that true? Was he not a kind man to the slaves that he owned, Ty?
Baloney is what I say to that. He was a cruel enslaver. So he garnered most of his wealth from enslaved labor, from stolen labor. His first enslaved labor that he, again, I don't like to use the word slave, because these people aren't. That's not who they are. It's the condition that they're in. So by saying enslaved person, it lets us know that this is a condition they didn't choose for themselves, and in fact fought against for most of their lives. So
Well said.
he first got enslaved people from his mother when she died in the late 1820s, early 1830s, and he hired them out throughout his entire life, gaining wealth. So in other words, rather than keeping those families together, he hired them out across the state of Virginia. So then, when his father-in-law died in 1857, he became the executor of the estate. That's Arlington, and there are two other plantations. Except I don't like to use the word plantation, because plantation evokes moonlight and magnolias, of the wind whispering through the Spanish moss, and scarlet on the steps of Tara saying fiddle dee dee. No, these are enslaved labor farms, more Dachau than Disneyland. Okay,
Yeah.
so he is the person that's running these from 1857 to 1860. He gets 2 years of paid administrative leave, the longest of anybody in the antebellum army, to go do this. And when he gets there, his father-in-law kept enslaved families together, not Lee. He breaks all of them apart except one. So on January 1st used to be the most dreaded day for enslaved families, because that was the day you found out where you were being hired out to, splitting apart husband and wife, splitting apart children from their mother, and sending them all over the place to make more money. He always chose to make more money rather than human dignity. And then when people escaped, they didn't escape. They moved to freedom because actually the father-in-law said they should be freed 5 years at the latest. Lee kept them as long as he possibly could and went back to court to try to keep them longer. And so when some of them left, he found them in Maryland, brought them back. A man and two men and a woman, one a wife, a sister and brother, and he ordered them whipped. The local person on the plantation would not do the whipping, so he brought in a constable from outside, told the constable to lay it on well, and then poured brine water on the wounds to ensure that it stung even more. Next thing he did was that, first, you got to remember, he fought for a slave republic. If you fight for a slave republic, it means you believe in slavery. His army was an enslaving army. His logistics trained 8 to 10,000 enslaved people, cooks, teamsters, farriers, ditch diggers, you name it. They were all in slave labor, and he wanted more and more of that. And then when he went north in the Antietam and Gettysburg campaign, his army captured free Black people and brought them back to Virginia for sale. His army executed Black prisoners of war and would not accept them as Black POWs. And then after the war, people say, oh, the kindly Lee after the war. After the war, he actually believed in ethnic cleansing. He testified before Congress that if it was up to him, he would kick every Black person out of the state of Virginia, and said that this Black population is only good for the laboring class. They should never have political power. So that's my argument
Well said.
on Lee, the cruel enslaver.
I mean, I
And
think
racist.
the comment chain is just going up, right? I mean, that's absolutely heartbreaking. Thank you for that incredibly detailed response. Let me talk to you about this. The other thing I always heard was that, at the end of the day, Robert E. Lee he didn't want the South to secede. He was such a great patriot, but he just loved the state of Virginia, and that's why he left the U.S. Army, because he just believed in his home state, and he wanted to make sure that he could serve his state and his hometown. What are your reactions to that?
Well, I would quote my president, who says malarkey. Malarkey to that.
All right.
It's a word we don't use enough anymore. So
Agree.
malarkey. So here's why I say that's malarkey. First of all, he violated the Constitution. The Constitution there's only one crime in the Constitution, and that is Article 3, Section 3, which is levying war against the United States is treason. And you have to have two witnesses. And did he levy war against the United States? How could you not say? Nobody did it more than him. More than two witnesses. Remember, Lee killed more U.S. Army soldiers than any other enemy soldier, any enemy officer in our history. Lee killed more than anybody else. Well, okay, he had to go with Virginia. Oh, Virginia, my state, occasionally you have to be my deep Southern accent sometimes sounds like Foghorn Leghorn, so I have to be careful of my deep Southern accent. Nonetheless, so there were in 1861, by June of 1861, there were 8 U.S. Army colonels in the Army from Virginia. 8. Everybody's 8. 8.
8.
7 of those remained loyal to the United States. One and only one chose treason and chose to fight against the United States. And some of those ones that fought are well known. George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. His sisters disavowed him, turned his portrait around, so that his face faced the wall. Another famous one is Winfield Scott, who is the commanding general of the Army. For West Point graduates, Dennis Hart Mahan, who was also from Virginia, who is a famous West Pointer, was teaching there at West Point. So, and many of his family said this. Another famous Virginian, I think one of the other 8 colonels said, as soon as I see in my oath that it says the state of Virginia in there, I'll do that. No, my oath says the United States. It says obey the orders of the president. So his sister never talked to him again because he did this. Many of his family, to include cousins and best friends, stayed with the United States. So you have to think then, okay, Lee and only Lee chose treason. Lee and only Lee did this. Why? Because he had such abiding belief in racial control through slavery, in the idea that slavery was the best system for him economically. And again, he benefited off of this. Slaves were worth more than anything else in the South. The price of slaves was at an all-time high in 1860, and it was not going away. And Lee fought for slavery because he believed in slavery, and he chose treason to do that.
I mean, as you speak with both, by the way, your passion, your I mean, you're incredibly precise. These facts just they're there. I guess I mean, we have a black superintendent at West Point. We have a black
And Air Force,
secretary
by
of
the way,
defense, a black exactly
right?
at Air Force. Like, I guess what I'm sure a lot of us, both in uniform and out, are thinking is, why is this so hard? Like, we're celebrating these relics of rebellion against the United States. Why does this continue to be a challenge for our country, Ty? What are we not getting as a country?
Yeah, I think here's the thing. Culture is stronger than facts. Culture is stronger than history. So if you grew up in this milieu, you believe it more. So I'll give you, I can't give an answer without telling a story. So let me tell one story about this. So there I am at West Point, and we are about to do the new memorial room. So as you may know, we lost more than 100 graduates killed at West Point
Yeah.
in the wars on terror. And in fact, to put that in perspective, Yale during World War One lost had 10 times the number of casualties, the number of killed in action during World War One than did West Point. Since that time, in the wars on terror, Yale's lost zero, West Point 100. So the community was really reeling about this. So we wanted to. I was chair of the memorialization committee. I said, well, let's repurpose a room in Cullum Hall, which you know well, and
Yeah.
we'll put the names of the 1,500 graduates that died from the War of 1812 through the War on Terror, and we'll put them in this one room. And so I got the money, I got everybody to agree, but there was one problem that really raised a ruckus, and that was, should those who fought in gray, who left the United States Army, left the United States to fight for the Confederacy and died, should their names go in our Valhalla, this room that has all those killed in action? And I went before the academic board and argued no. They abrogated their oath. They fought. They committed treason. They chose to destroy the United States, kill U.S. Army soldiers for the worst possible reason, to create a slave republic. And by the way, the building where they are is actually created by an anti-Confederate, Cullum, who said, "I will never forgive those who forgot the flag to follow false gods." And the actual law says no unworthy subjects can go in there. So I go and I give the facts, just like I did now, like a machine
Yeah.
gun of fact,
Right, right.
like that. And I finished with this, and I'm like, man, did I just crush this? And what do they do? 2/3 vote to put the Confederates in. I lose. I go back to talk to my wife about this, tail between my legs, saying, "Oh my God, Sherry, can you believe it? I mean, my brilliant argument, nothing." And she said, "Ty, well, did you tell your own story?" And I said, because no, I said, "No, heck no. Historians tell other people's story, not their own." And I realized that the only way I was going to get people to understand this is if I was vulnerable enough to tell the story that I grew up with these same myths that they did. Because what they were saying is, hey, we just want to bring people together. And in fact, one of the arguments that was put forward is we want to be like the Sunni and Shia fighting for centuries, which is the worst historical argument in the history of the world. And it's terrible. It has nothing to do with one or the other. But that's what they were saying. They said, bring people together. But they didn't understand that reconciliation had a very specific meaning in American history, which is bring white people together at the expense of black people. And they didn't understand that. So I had another senior leader at West Point tell me, because they were really upset, that what ended up happening is a black graduate found out about this, raised hell, and said, if you do this, I'm going to take it to the press. And they re-voted to exclude them. But the senior leaders at West Point blamed me, thought that I
Yeah.
leaked it, which I didn't do. But they said, "Oh God, Ty, listen, putting Confederate names in there has nothing to do with race." I was like, "Oh my gosh, yeah, you don't know anything about this war." Well, so I knew that I had to be able to educate people, but the best way to do that is to tell my own story, and that's why so many people don't understand this, is because they're unwilling or never learned it, and then they don't want to do it. Because remember, um, history is dangerous because it challenges our myths and our identities, and when somebody challenges your myth, the reaction can be ferocious.
Absolutely. I mean, I was even thinking we're, right now, I guess the baby boomer generation right now is a generation whose potentially grandparents were maybe very young, but certainly alive during Reconstruction, right? And probably passing down a lot of stories, values, remnants of the Civil War, relics that they now worship, and it can be incredibly personal and tragic to hear that your parent was a traitor. Someone in your family owned slaves and was a traitor and was a racist. These are things that can hang heavy on our shoulders. Yet, grappling with that history is the only way we're going to get get anywhere, isn't it, Ty?
Yeah, yeah, but you don't own the actions of somebody that lived in the 1860s or the 1930s. But you do have a obligation to be honest about the facts, to tell the truth about these things. But you don't have to say, "Hey, John Smith, my ancestor who fought with the Confederacy, that's who I want to emulate." No, go pick somebody from World War II. I mean, the United States Army. I always, I mean, going to the Holocaust Museum is a tough thing to do. We always took cadets there in the history department, and as you enter into it, there are the battle flags of each division that liberated the camps at the end of the war. And you can say, that's where I want to take my heritage from. Choose that one. Don't
Yeah.
choose people that chose treason to preserve slavery. It was an evil cause. So too often when we think about the Civil War, we divorce the purpose of the war from those who fought it. Well, we can't do that. We must look first at, when I'm trying, well, years I was at Gettysburg or Antietam, I took cadets there. I let the smell of gunpowder seduce me into separating those that fought from why they fought. But why they fought is so important. You cannot ever do that. We don't do that with the Nazis. Now, listen, I'm not trying to compare the Nazis, and yet they are a race-based society. The Nazis get some of their ideas from both the Confederates and the eugenics movement. So there is a race-based nature to both of these societies. You don't have to or you don't have to own that. Don't own it. It's not yours to own, but you do have a responsibility to own the facts. And the only way to do that, though, for me to do it, is through storytelling. Storytelling will change people's minds where facts often won't.
I got a question for you, Ty, that came in from someone who does not necessarily agree or sympathize with name changing of all of these bridges, barracks, etc. And their perspective was when we honor someone with a name. With their name on a monument, it is not said that we honor the entirety of who that person is. We are all flawed human beings. Why can't we not admire them for the virtues which we choose and be forgiving for their flaws? Is that not possible? And I think that's interesting, right? Because every monument we're going to have, if we dig deep in history, we're going to find something that is obscene, is horrible, things that we as modern day folks don't like. So why not just be discerning about what virtues we're admiring and what we're not when it comes to these Confederate relics?
Oh, that's a great question. So the thing is that I do, excuse me, is to look at the context with which they were put up. And Confederate monuments, and you can read the speeches that there. And remember that Confederate monuments were put up to particularly 1890, 1920, to show that we're back in charge now. The white people are back in the saddle, and we're showing that this is about Anglo-Saxon white supremacy. And they say that in all of those. That's why we're doing this. So remember, a monument tells you more about who put it up than about the actual figure memorialized, because they're doing it for a reason. So when these were done, particularly in front of courthouses, they were done to cow the black population. So there's a purpose, and it's a pernicious purpose that these are put up. The other part is that remember that who we honor is commemoration is about our values. Commemoration reflects our values. At West Point, we're still going to talk about the Battle of Chancellorsville. The Battle of Chancellorsville, Lee defeats Hooker. He kicks Hooker's butt, and he does it every year. Every year we do the Battle of Chancellorsville, and every year he wins. It's not changing the history or the facts of that. Commemoration changes who we represent. So if you go to Richmond right now, and I was just there recently, Richmond used to have, as you know, the Monument Avenue. They used to have
Yeah.
have all these huge statues up there that were put up to support white supremacy, to say this is our zone of the town, not yours. It's about white supremacy. So what's there now? Well, overlooking the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who are one of the most powerful groups ever in the history of America, that put forward this lost cause lie, that paid for many of these monuments, there's now a statue overlooking it called Rumor of War. It's made to look like Jeb Stuart's statue, which was this heroic cavalryman up on horseback like this, with his, sort of ready to ride. Well, now that Rumor of War statue just put up is of a young black man in a hoodie with dreadlocks, Nikes, and ripped torn jeans. And he's on this heroic statue, and it's dominating this formerly white supremacist organization. There's another one called Emancipation and Freedom Monument in Richmond. So it shows a woman with a baby in one arm holding the Emancipation Proclamation in one hand, like it's proud, I'm free. Down below, it shows a black a free black man with his hands out like that, shackles dropping with whip marks on his back. So now it's saying, let's remember the other parts of our history, because when you remember the tough parts, you become a more empathetic people. And I tell you who's doing that right now: the Germans. The Germans have come and dealt with their past, and it's making them a more empathetic and better society because they have dealt with the Holocaust in such a fundamental way that we have not yet begun to do. We're only starting. But remember, I'll tell you one more thing here. Remember, we've only been a democracy for 50 years. You're like,
Yeah.
what? We're only a democracy for 50 years. Well, the Voting Rights Act comes in 1965. It takes several years before that is enacted. That's when all Americans, regardless of their skin color, are allowed to vote. So we're a very recent democracy in many ways. And that's why we have to fight to continue that democracy, because it is never a sure thing, because we are such a recent democracy.
That is absolutely a beautiful point. Ty, I got one more question for you, and then can I let you go?
Yep.
I know you're a busy
Oh,
man.
sorry. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. So you've been on the road preaching this very difficult message for Americans to hear. I mean, and I imagine you often encounter folks that are highly resistant to this idea. And I guess from your perspective, like, what gives you hope? What is it that fires this energy, this passion? What gives you hope? Because I imagine as you run into brick walls day in and day out, definitely at the hands of our government and these institutions that are big giant aircraft carriers that don't turn very easily. Like, I'm curious, what's feeding that fire? What gives you hope when you're out on the field?
Well, two things. First is, as everyone knows, converts have the most zeal. So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
One, I'm a convert, so that is the most zeal. The second is that I see change. I see there's a sea change in a way. I see it in the federal government with this commission that I'm on to change the name of the Army bases. I look at it in Richmond, they're all gone. They're changing in various places throughout the South. And so as soon as people realize how terrible these monuments are and why they were put up, more people are going to change their minds. And we often quote Churchill, which is, "You can count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all other possibilities." I believe in the hope of America. I've got the flag behind me. I love this country, and I consider myself a patriot. But we should know that patriots, as James Baldwin once said, "I love my country so much. That's why I have to criticize her so strenuously." And I believe in that too. The best way to make this country better is the only way to making sure we don't have a racist future is to first understand our racist past.
Ty, that was a phenomenal way to close our session. Everybody, I cannot recommend this book enough. This is Robert E. Lee and Me by Ty Seidule, A Southerner's Reckoning with the myth of the lost cause, something I think we all as Americans need to come to terms with. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Please pick it up. And we're going to try our best to continue the discussion. Ty, I think I speak for the entire community. Our chat window just got so overwhelmed that I don't even think I could have answered we couldn't have gotten these questions if we tried. I think you did a phenomenal job. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you know that all of us are cheering you on from the sidelines. And if there's anything we can do to support you, I hope you let us know.
Thanks so much, Rajiv. I had a great time talking. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate you tuning in.
All right, 99 pages. We're going to be back in about 3-4 weeks. Details to come with Mr. Jimmy Soni. He's the author of The Founders, the story of the entrepreneurs who shaped Silicon Valley via the PayPal mafia. Really excited to talk to Jimmy. More details to come on that. But until then,